start the chapter, I guess. Um, so for those of you that haven't had my classes before, the way the book's set up, at least the books that I'm using right now, um, it's like one big long textbook, and they cut it down the middle. That's why we're starting on chapter 14. So don't worry about that. I can't really think of anything else to start out with. Does anybody have any questions before we start our first proper day? Okay. So, the first chapter, Emancipation through Reconstructions, 1863 to 1877. As I mentioned on the first day, we will have several chapters that cover the same time period, but we'll either be talking about like different geographic locations in the country or different like aspects of the country. So timeline wise, we'll probably be going over the same period a couple of times, but thematically they'll be different. So for example, this is 63 to 77. The next chapter goes back to 1865 to like about 1900. So just kind of give you an example of what we'll be talking about. So it's not strictly linear. Yeah. All right. So this is technically post-Civil War, although our first bit of information. Actually, let me check and make sure that everything is running properly. Okay, streaming is streaming. Channel live, yes, great, awesome, cool. All right, back to this. Okay. So we start with before the Civil War even really properly ended, there was some emancipation in the South. For example, in the Sea Islands here in South Carolina, areas that had been occupied by Union troops, the freed slaves were, well, freed and formed their communities under the protection of the troops. However, this typically only lasted as long as the troops stuck around, because once they left, the former plantation owners would come back and try to reassert control, which typically would lead to all sorts of violence. And that would mirror things to come, because things don't get better. Richmond, Virginia, April of 1865, post-Civil War. Free slaves expressed their joy at emancipation. They gathered together. They sung hymns. Again, this was only possible as long as there were Union troops there to keep them safe, because once they left, the former slave owners would, quote, punish the freed slaves for being happy about being freed, which would typically result in violence. It's not locked. Oh, you're good. What's your last name again? Cool. All right. Just a few left. Hopefully, well, they were here last time. Maybe they're not in my class. All right. So this resulted in the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, full name Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It's formed by Congress, signed into law by Lincoln. This specifically provided aid to former slaves, in the form of financial and legal resources, because due to the laws that were in existence prior to the end of the Civil War, they weren't considered citizens. They were no longer slaves, but they could not be made citizens. They were simply people in a country that wasn't theirs, despite the fact that they had been there for generations. So yeah, they had no legal recourse. They had no kind of protection by the law, and needless to say, they had no kind of money. Being freed from slavery is all well and good, but you're at the bottom. You have no resources, and very few places to go. So the Freedmen's Bureau was very important in helping these people survive, really, to start with. So one of the first things that the freed blacks wanted to do was to find their families. It was something we talked more about last semester, but when slave owners would sell their slaves, they obviously weren't too concerned about keeping family units together because they treated them like animals. So now that slavery was over, the freedmen did their best to find their extended families. The Freedmen's Bureau did their best to help them out. However, this was made difficult due to the many records that were destroyed during the war, either due to just buildings being burned or the slave owners themselves destroying the records because they didn't want to be punished for their own atrocities during the war. This is mostly because when I started teaching this class, I was upstate. We know what the Sea Islands are. I would imagine. I mean, we're here, so the Sea Islands aren't that far away. When I was teaching this originally, I was like way up here. More people had been, to Georgia or the mountains than had ever been to the coast. And the Sea Islands were, due to their isolation, kind of their own little community anyway. Again, if you've ever been to the Sea Islands, they're different from the coastal regions. They are their own separate little thing, even today. And of course, we have the celebration of the Emancipation, and then I've got an actual photograph here. This is probably a few years after Emancipation, because photography existed back then. We have photographs of Lincoln, for example. This is probably maybe 5 years after Emancipation. This is on the anniversary of it in Richmond, Virginia. And as you can see from the buildings and the clothing, it's still, and just the photograph, it's still pretty old. Well, no, there's power lines. This is probably maybe 1900. And the Freedmen's Bureau doing their best to keep the freedmen safe, which, as we're going to see, they had a hard time doing that. Oh, right, okay. Extremely racist cartoon incoming, but it's literally in the book, and it's important for how people felt about the Freedmen's Bureau. And by people, I mean, obviously, the racists that didn't want black people to be free. So we've got this. To keep them in idleness at the expense of the white man. Vetoed by the president, which is to say, President Johnson. We'll talk about Johnson in a little bit. Made law by Congress. Yeah. Boy, this is familiar. Oh no, these people that are like at the lowest class of society, that are treated like garbage, they're taking advantage of you. You should be more angry about them than you are just because you're racist. Yeah. So that's the thing. So after finding their families, um, the next thing that many among the communities wanted was an education. It was very important to maintaining their freedom, as we'll see going forward. Um, they better understand politics and policies of the day, maybe even one day get a vote, uh, which again we'll get to in just a little bit. Um, Needless to say, funding for education in the South was close to non-existent. Boy, it's nice to see how much that's changed over the years, huh? Demand was far beyond the supply. So any building was used for schools, courthouses, cotton barns, even a mule stable at one point. Just anything to, get out of the rain and be able to teach. And the main lesson they wanted to learn was to be able to read. It's something I always bring up each semester. When it comes to education, there's really two things that need to be taught: how to read and how to be able to question what you read. Reading is extremely important because that's how we get all our information. But then you spend the rest of your life learning to be critical of what you take in because people are going to try to sell you something, be it an actual thing or, their point of view. Now, as far as reading here, it was important to be able to read labor contracts because laborers would often put clauses in their contracts to exploit owners would put clauses in their contracts to exploit their laborers, which obviously would have been worse for these newly freed slaves, but it was bad for everybody. Like we have multiple chapters talking about unions and how workers had to band together because capitalism. So, and also just literacy in the U.S. was not especially high anyway among those that weren't rich. So it was really easy for employers to take advantage of their employees, and it happened a lot. So this wasn't just a thing among the newly freed people. However, another main thing they wanted for reading was to be able to read the Bible, because, especially in the South, if the only people who could read the Bible were the racist white preachers who would use it to justify slavery and say it was a good thing, but if you could read it for yourself, you could see what it actually said. This is literally the reason one of the reasons the Protestant Reformation happened, back in the 1600s, was the Bible was only written in Latin, and the priests could tell you whatever the heck they wanted. And so the people were like, hey, maybe we should have it in the language that we can read, and the Catholic Church got all pissy about it, and now we've got 1 million different Protestant denominations. So yeah. So obviously this led to an explosion of black churches all throughout the country. Again, those of you that were here last semester, we talked about at least one, or the creation of the first black denomination prior to the war. But now that slavery is not a thing, and they're technically free, even if they're still not technically citizens, there's black preachers being hired all over the place because these churches are in high demand. And also the church buildings are being used for communal gatherings, in particular political organizing, because that was the place to go. I mean, that's still kind of how it is, at least in this part of the country. The church is where the community is for a lot of places. So here's a freedmen's school. This is obviously not a mule stable. This is a one that's built specifically for the purpose, but it's still, a rough-hewn log cabin. And the teachers were usually abolitionists from the north who came down south to help to teach. And as you can see in this photograph and in these illustrations I have, it wasn't just kids, because obviously the slaves were not taught to read while they were enslaved. It was strongly discouraged. So it wasn't just kids learning to read, it was adults as well. They were very excited to be able to learn how to read. So you had a lot of instances of this where you've got the children over here and then the adults like right behind them learning right alongside them, because if you can't read, you can't read. And that's a skill that typically, obviously it's easier for a child because their brains are still more malleable, but it's something that you can pick up. And then, of course, we've got the churches. Still not quite as good as the one that I've got from last semester, where it's from the side, and it's so full that people are like behind where he's standing because they've run out of room in front. And then baptism, by standing out, and clearly the very hot sun. So we all got our parasols there. Ugh. Oh, I'm just imagining the humidity. All right. So in 1863, Lincoln issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Again, this is before the war actually ended. The war ended in 1865. He believed the South had not constitutionally seceded from the Union, so it should be easier to bring it back into the Union. Basically, they hadn't done all the work to actually be treasonous. So it should be easier to just get them back in the Union. His main goal was to fix the problems that happened in the Civil War and get it all smoothed over, because it was a mess. So in order for a state to return to the Union, it had to accept the abolition of slavery, and 10% of those who were eligible to vote, which is to say Southern white men, had to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, which feels real small, but I guess in a region that you just had a civil war with, what are you going to do? Heavy amnesty to all but the highest ranking Confederate officials, so like a lot of the actual officers in the Confederacy weren't ever brought to trial. So within a year and a half, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee had all agreed to this 10% plan. Considering, though, it took a year and a half for 3 to even agree to this, and the rest of them were still, sitting on their hands. However, Republicans in Congress wanted harsher restrictions. I'm going to repeat myself throughout this semester, but it needs to be said. Prior to Nixon, which is to say the 1950s and 1960s, the Democrat and Republican Party were on opposite ends of the political spectrum. Lincoln's Republican Party was the liberal party, whereas Democrats were the more conservative party. Because when you look at a map of voting in this period, and the South is completely blue, that's not saying the South was voting liberal. Just FYI, that's what we're talking about here. You do get some bad faith arguments. So I was like, well, Lincoln was a Republican. It's like, yeah, 1800s Republican, dude. Stop being dumb. So that said, the Republicans in Congress wanted to punish the South for, treason. They should be seen as conquered provinces. Wade Davis bill would have raised the 10% to 50%, but Lincoln shot it down with a pocket veto. I don't know how that's different from like a regular veto, but whatever. It doesn't especially matter. Now, while Lincoln and Congress did butt heads, they did work together on some things. For example, pushing through the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, which is important, obviously. And again, his main goal was to unify the North and South and heal the wounds that the war had caused. Because while, yeah, we lost like 600,000 men in that war, which was more than we've lost in any war to date, the main thing was the animosity that the war caused. Because, I mean, like, literally my grandmother you would have thought the war was still on. Of course, though, Lincoln would never get the chance to see Reconstruction through because John Wilkes Booth decided to be an idiot and shot him in the back of the head. So, after being assassinated, the White House was left to Andrew Johnson, and Andrew Johnson maintains the enviable rank as one of the worst presidents we've ever had. He was not ready for any of what was going on. It's kind of ironic that Booth thought he was doing something for the South when in fact he was making things so much worse. So, good work, Booth. All right. So, Andrew Johnson. To start out with, he was a Democrat. Kind of weird that a Republican's running mate is the other party, but that's sort of how things were done back then. Politics were weird back in the day. Again, those of you that had me last semester know about this, but like the first proper election we had, they elected the guy who won, and then the guy who got second place was made vice president, and that didn't go well. So, yeah, it was mostly used to get border states because, well, states on the border between the North and the South weren't too keen on Lincoln, but hey, Andrew Johnson's a Democrat, he's a rural guy, we can vote for the ticket if he's on it. But the thing about vice presidents back then is they didn't do anything. That was, they weren't meant to do anything. Like today, they've got, they're part of Congress, and, they lead the Senate, I think. They've got like all these ambassadorial duties. They're always doing stuff. Whereas back then they were like the understudy in a play, where if the president's fine, they sit on their hands for 4 years. But if something happens, suddenly they're in charge. And a lot of times, that's not for the best. He was not ready, not just for the political ramifications of being president, but his personal values, are going to make things worse. And let's look at that. So, Johnson was born into rural poverty in the South, and for him, the real enemy was Southern aristocracy. He didn't like the rich plantation owners in the South. They were, for him, the problem. They were the reason he was in poverty all his life, et cetera, et cetera. For him, slavery was just a tool that the Southern aristocracy used. So getting rid of it's all well and good. It's taking a tool away from them, but he didn't care what happened to the people that were enslaved. For him, it wasn't some kind of moral evil that needed to be fixed. It was just a tool to take away from the Southern aristocracy. The states could figure it out after that. He didn't care. Which isn't good. So the main thing he did was messing with these rich Southerners. He had them petition to him directly for amnesty. Now, I don't know if that means that they actually had to come to D.C. and, like, meet with him personally and, like, beg him to not send them to super jail. Or if they just had to write a letter to him, which even then, that was a process. Either way, they basically had to beg him for mercy, which he pretty much gave to all of them. He just wanted to have them grovel. That was pretty much all it was. After that, he just let the South pretty much do what it wanted to do. He didn't really care. His only requirements for states coming back, 13th Amendment, revoking ordinances of secession, and refusing to pay Confederate war debts, which is to say, you give up slavery, obviously, we just had a war about that, revoking ordinances of secession, which is to say you're not seceded from the Union anymore, which is kind of the point of returning to the Union. And also, the United States is not going to pay for the debts you incurred while fighting the United States. You got to take care of that yourself. That's the problem you made. But because he just let them do whatever beyond that, many Confederate officials won elections in the South. For example, Georgia elected the Confederate Vice President Andrew Stevens into the U.S. Senate. Oh well. Meanwhile, South Carolina and Mississippi refused to repudiate the war debt because, obviously, and Mississippi refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. What the hell, Mississippi? Granted, Mississippi is also the state that until really recently had the Confederate battle flag on their state flag, so, yeah, Mississippi is like that, I guess. But also, all across the South, black codes were put in place that restricted basic rights of the black population, bearing arms, intermarriage, jury duty, just basic rights that white people had that were now crimes if the black population tried to enact them. And here's the thing. How many of you are familiar with the last part of the 13th Amendment? Because it ends slavery except for a specific case. Well, no, it's a federal thing, so it was across. There's a specific instance where slavery is allowed in the 13th Amendment. And technically it's still in the books to this day. And it will make a lot of sense once I tell you. Also, we're going to skip this real quick because I'll come back to that in a minute. We'll worry about Johnson in a minute. Yeah, well, it makes more sense. Next slide. Prison. If you're in prison, you can be legally enslaved. You can be made to work for the government without pay. And when the South starts passing laws that only affect the black population, suddenly we have a whole lot of enslaved black folk again. That was not coincidental. And you can argue, rightfully, that certain systemic laws and whatnot are continuing that to this day, but that's for a different class. I don't know why they put Johnson in this weird jester outfit, but that's a thing. You got the Reconstruction, how it works. This is another like 1800s meme that you would see a lot. The crocodile tears at the spirit of concord and brotherly affection. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. Yeah, so you break a law, or really, realistically, if you're found to be black in the South, congratulations, you go to jail, and now you can be made to do convict labor. And as I've said, that's still a thing. Not as blatant as it used to be, but yeah, convict labor is still a thing. I mean, that's how that's who they send in to fight fires in California and stuff. And they often die doing that. But who cares? They're convicts. Yes. Yeah. It's like, oh, it's a work release program, and you get like time off of your sentence if you go and do one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, usually under-equipped and not able to do it efficiently, and people do die doing that. Not, I wouldn't say adequately. I mean, a lot of firefighters are volunteer anyway, so like, oh, well, it's the same thing. And they're prisoners, so who cares? Yeah. We have a slight prison problem. Here we have the KKK and the White League, which is just a real broad term for all the people wanting to keep things the way they were, making it worse than slavery, according to this. Because, yeah, in a way, like, people were actively fearing for their lives. People were getting their homes burned down, shot in the street. We'll talk about the KKK a little bit more. I mean, they've even got the lost cause here, which is this myth of, the South was in the right for the war, and, oh, well, it was states' rights. Like, states' rights to what, guys? What was states' rights we were trying to protect? And sometimes some people will go to the next level, oh, it was economic. I was like, okay. What was the economic drive we were fighting for? It's always slavery. Don't let people try to weasel out of that crap. So, needless to say, Republicans in Congress were not too happy with the way Johnson was handling things. So when Southern lawmakers tried to return to Congress in December of 1865, they were just locked out. They were literally just not allowed in the building. Johnson denounced this as illegitimate, and now we officially have Johnson and Congress fighting one another. 1866, Johnson refused to sign a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau by 2 years, vetoed the Civil Rights Act a few months later, because of course. The Civil Rights Act was written to protect free people from restrictions of the black codes because it was really obvious what the black codes were about. I mean, it's in the freaking name. And Johnson was like, oh, no, we can't have that. It's infringing on the state's rights to handle their own economic affairs. Like, that's literally why we had a war, Johnson. So, yeah. So the thing about Congress is if they've got a 2/3 majority, they can just override a veto. And they did. They repassed the Freedmen's Bureau extension and the Civil Rights Act because Johnson's flagrant disregard of everything had radicals, being those that wanted to give civil rights to the black population, and moderates agreed that they needed to go against Johnson. Let's see. They adopted the 14th Amendment, which basically would put the Civil Rights Act into much more permanent status, because an act is a real temporary thing, but as an amendment, it stays on the books unless it's repealed by a later amendment. It also would overturn the Dred Scott case, which said that blacks were not citizens because that was what they were working with up to that point. Also, technically, I think still at this point, Native Americans were considered citizens, despite, the whole them having been here long before us. But who cares? Racism. And lawmakers realized that they needed to get this done fast because things were rapidly deteriorating in the South. There was a huge anti-black riot in Memphis, Tennessee the month before. I read here in the book, for a day and a half, white mobs, egged on by local police, gasp, went on a rampage, during which they terrorized black residents of the city and burned their houses and churches. And then we have the late riots in our city, the editor of a Memphis newspaper asserted, has satisfied all of one thing, that the Southern man would not be ruled by the Negro. It's like, wow, okay, so the riots are saying that it's the black people's fault. In fact, Johnson encouraged Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment, which is, again, to make the black people citizens. But it was his home state, Tennessee, was the first and only to initially accept the 14th Amendment. So, on the one hand, great, his home state actually was working with Congress. On the other, nobody else was on board with it. And that's when this image makes more sense, because it's Johnson vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau. I don't know why the Johnson has a massive head, but hey, it's political cartoons. That's pretty normal. And, they call chest of drawers bureaus sometimes. All right. So, moderates and radicals were allied against the president, began passing legislation. Even moderates who, again, even at this point, radicals were still real racist and considered black Americans as inferior to whites. But even they were like, hey, if these black citizens don't have the right to vote, slavery's just going to come back. That's just going to be how. That's just going to happen. At least in some degree, which again, with the way the 13th Amendment was written, So by the end of March, Congress had military reconstruction acts. The South was split into 5 military districts under the supervision of a Union general and his troops. The male voters in each state would have to delegate constitutional convention, except for former Confederate officials, because, hey, treason? They would then have to draft a new constitution for the state, which would guarantee black suffrage and ratify the 14th Amendment. Great. And within a year of this, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas had all done this and were readmitted into the Union. Obviously, Mississippi was one of the last ones because Mississippi. So while the South was under the control of Union generals, Congress decided that Johnson needed a bit of a whipping. Because while this was going on, he was trying to use his authority as commander-in-chief to tell the generals in the South to basically shirk their duties. So Congress passed the Command of the Army Act, where Johnson had to go through the General of the Army in Washington. The General of the Army was Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant was not going to go easy on the South. And he did end up winning election in 1868, so he's the next president. We'll talk about him in a little bit. So, yeah, that completely cut off Johnson from interfering with the military reconstruction. And this feels like they baited Johnson, because they knew he was going to be petulant and do it anyway. They passed the Tenure of Office Act, where Johnson could not remove a cabinet member without Senate approval. He did it anyway, because of course he did, and was technically, though not fully, impeached. So, which is to say, he was impeached in the House, but not the Senate. But for normal people, that's enough to sit down and stop being a nuisance. So following this, Johnson stopped trying to cause problems because he knew that if Congress really wanted to, they could kick him out of office. Because nobody really liked Johnson. This is very similar to an image in the book, except this one's color-coded, and it gives all the generals in the various regions. And also, so the thing that the book also has, so you've got the date that each state was readmitted to the Union, which is to say when they agreed to the demands, but then also when conservative rule returned to the states. Because, as we're going to see, Reconstruction kind of fell apart pretty quick. Also, there's Grant. He may or may not be drunk in this portrait, because Grant drank a lot, famously. Right. 15th Amendment. Protected black suffrage, which again was initially passed by the Military Reconstruction Act, but again, an amendment is stronger than an act. Prohibited discrimination based on race. However, voting can still be denied based on literacy, payment of taxes, moral character, etc. So, like, you can go to the polls, and the person at the polls be like, I don't think you have good enough moral character. You gotta leave. What's that mean? It doesn't matter. It's on the books. So that's why we had to have the civil rights movement in the 60s, because things weren't exactly, the loose ends were not quite tied up yet. So the American Anti-Slavery Society disbanded with the end of slavery because, hey, job's done. However, before they even had time to turn the lights off, they had to come back and form the American Equal Rights Association because, well, things were not fine yet. A lot of times in like high school level history, it's like, when the Civil War ended and everything was fine. No. That said, there were still concerns about the 14th Amendment. as it inserted the word male into the Constitution for the first time. So far, the Constitution had been very gender neutral, even though women were still clearly excluded. But now this was specifically saying that men had the right to vote and that men were citizens. And this was repeated with the 15th Amendment. So some women wanted female suffrage over black suffrage, while others believed that extending the vote to the freedmen would eventually lead the way to the female vote. Granted, it would take another like 50 years because we moved real slow on that. So we had the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was Stanton and Anthony. They were big names last semester. Opposed the 15th Amendment, while the American Women's Suffrage Association, which had men and women, white and black, because they supported the 15th Amendment. 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, but women were left out of the vote because, again, it's not until like after World War I that they have the right to vote, because we move real freaking slow. And here's some women protesting. Apparently, a woman who was arrested for demonstrating about the right to vote. So, yeah. You're like, they don't even do this in Russia. What's wrong with you guys? American Women's Suffrage Association meeting. All right. So, Johnson's sitting in the corner because he's been bad. We're getting into the Reconstruction, finally, properly. Now, while, of course, the rich white men in the South were so worried that, once the slaves were freed, they were going to murder everybody. I remember that was like a concern with my racist-ass grandparents and my parents. When Obama was running for president, I was like, if he makes president, there's going to be a race war. It's like, what is wrong with you people? I survived the non-existent race war. Anyway, same thing here. It's like, oh no, if they're free, they're going to murder all of us, which, like, they might have been justified. Obviously, the ones in power were still typically rich white men, because they were the ones with the economic power and the political power anyway. Only one rebel was actually executed for war crimes. He was the commandant of the Andersonville prison in Georgia. He did lots of war crimes. And only one official actually went to prison, which is to say Jefferson Davis. The president of the Confederacy was the only one who actually went to prison for fighting against the U.S. And within 7 years, most who had fought in the Civil War had their right to vote restored and could run for office again. So, like, apparently fighting against the U.S. in a civil war isn't considered a felony. Because, like, today, you do any sort of little felony. It's like, you can't ever vote again, ever. So during the first 5 years of Reconstruction, there were two groups of whites that held most of the power in the South. There were Republicans within the South who had opposed secession initially because, we talked about this even in the Revolutionary War. Not everybody was on board with what ended up happening. Not everybody in the South wanted the Civil War. These were mostly small merchants, mountain dwellers. They were called scalawags, which is another term for scoundrels by the Democrats. They were seen as traitors because they didn't support treason? I don't know. The other group are Northerners who moved to the South to aid in Reconstruction. They saw it as a new frontier because the South was like 50 to 100 years behind the North in terms of technological advancement. Um, Most of that was because the Southern plantation owners wanted to keep things backward. Um, they were seen as coming to plunder the resource-rich South before returning home with everything they could carry, and were dubbed carpetbaggers because they had these really awful bags made out of carpet material. Um, and while they certainly were not the majority of political power, the freed blacks who now could actually vote were very enthusiastic about being able to exercise this right. Um, Now, again, this only could happen when they were able to work with sympathetic whites because I'll get to it. But they did help shape politics. Sharecropping was really the main agricultural agreement of the day. If you're not familiar with sharecropping, it's where you work on another person's farm and you're paid a portion of your work as your pay, basically. You don't make money. You're not going to get rich doing sharecropping. It's the closest thing to slavery besides being in prison that you could get. It's not a good deal. And then we also had the Exodusters, which were black communities that cropped up in the Midwest as blacks were making their way out of the South because, I mean, yeah, I don't blame them. Also, that's just a really neat name, and I decided to make sure we included it because they were on their exodus out of the South, and as they got into the Midwest, it was much more dusty than they were familiar with, so they combined them, and it's a really great name. Now, again, having been raised here in the South and going to a pretty conservative school, this was how I learned about the carpetbaggers, is they were these snidely whiplash motherfuckers that were, they're just trying to take advantage of the South. Carpetbaggers is pitifully plain, use Southern defeat for personal gain. Okay, and then here we have, the fallen South. Okay, why did the South fall? What happened? Who did they fight? Oh, the United States? Huh. Why? Why were they doing that? Slavery? Oh, were we supposed to feel bad about that? Yeah. We just ignore all that. Ignore all that. And also, this wasn't what was going on. So, again, real quick, scalawags, someone who supports the cause for his or her own gain. White Southern Republicans were known as scalawags because they were seen as traitors. And the carpetbaggers, they had these awful bags made of carpet material. And while this one, as I said, it's not the whiplash, if you don't know who that is, Jesus, I'm sorry. This fella, it's hard to see because the carpetbagger is kind of in his face, but that's a Jewish caricature. So we're going to be anti-Semitic and saying that the North is coming to steal our resources. So, yay! Anyway, here's some folks heading west. I particularly like this image. Not only, again, is it a photograph, so you're able to kind of see just the mundanity of life, but it reminds me of a place my dad would take me a lot as a kid, out by the mill where he worked, where it was just like these stretches of land over the swamp. So this piece I particularly like. Right. Needless to say, not everybody was on board with these interracial governments. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. I can't remember if it was North Carolina. I think it was North Carolina that in this time period, or the Reconstruction, like an all-black city council had gotten elected, and a bunch of the people in the town couldn't have that, so they like stormed the council chambers and basically forced the people out and essentially overthrew the government of their little town because they couldn't have black people in there because they were just so terrified of, oh no, people with melanin in their skin, they're going to get us. So yeah, this has been happening for a long time. So yeah, as I said, as early as 1870 and as late as 1877, Republican governments were were voted out in favor of Democrats who claimed to be bringing redemption to the South. Again, those of you that were here last semester, I had mentioned the Redemptioners and how they were very different from another group we're going to talk about. This is the other group, the Redeemers. Hoo boy. Now, they won through the vote. However, they won the vote through violence, intimidation, voter fraud, and sometimes just straight up shooting people. And one group of these Redeemers, easily the most famous group, was, of course, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Founded in 1865 in Biloxi, Tennessee by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. There is an entire museum, apparently, in his honor somewhere in the backwoods up north. Not up north. In the upcountry here in South Carolina. Because why not? Physical force that frightened people away from the ballot box. And when fear didn't work, they would just murder people. They killed 150 African Americans in 1871 in Jackson County, Florida, and hundreds of Republicans in the 1875 election in Mississippi. Because if people are getting murdered for trying to vote, you're going to be less likely to go out and vote. So not only are they, cutting down numbers by literally killing the people, but they're also frightening those who are still alive. That's their main thing. They're literally domestic terrorists. Like, by definition, they're using terror to affect politics. Eventually, the government stepped in, used Force Acts in 1870 and 71 to dispatch officials to the South. 1872, Congress established a joint committee to probe Klan activities. This produced 13 volumes of vivid testimony of Klan activities and the atrocities they committed. And I will read one bit out of the book just to give you guys a taste of what we're talking about, because somehow people try to whitewash this. Like, I literally was just watching a thing yesterday where some schmuck was like interviewing the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. It was like, oh, I think you're a great guy. It's like, what the anyway, Elias Hill, a freedman from South Carolina who had become a Baptist preacher and teacher, was one of those who appeared before Congress. He and his brother lived next door to each other. The Klansmen went first to his brother's house where, as Hill testified, they broke open the door and attacked his wife, where I heard her screaming and moaning. At last I heard them rape her in the yard. She was crying, and the Ku Klux were whipping her to make her tell where I lived. When Klansmen finally discovered Elias Hill, they dragged him out of his house, accused him of preaching against the Klan, beat and whipped him, and threatened to kill him. On the basis of such testimony, the federal government prosecuted some 3,000 Klansmen. Only 600 were convicted. Gasp. Klan disbanded in the wake of federal prosecution. Other vigilante organizations arose to take its place, and obviously the Klan came back like twice after that. They're still very much a force today. So, yeah. So here we have, this is A White Man's Government by Thomas Nast. This is in Harper's Weekly. This is what the Klan and the White Leagues and all those people that are against the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments want is the return of, well, white supremacy. Literally. Here's the Klan and their old duds. This is an image from the book. This one's in color. The one in the book is in black and white. But yeah, they would just like come into people's homes and shoot them. Women and children, didn't matter. Shoot them, bring them out in the yard, hang them from their own trees in the front yard, beat them to death. You got the point across. And here we have, this is Horace Greeley. He ran against Ulysses S. Grant. Anything to beat Grant. Let's clasp hands over the bloody chasm. That was a common refrain by Grant, which is to say we need to unify the country after the Civil War, whereas this is being used because the bloody chasm is what the bodies were creating in the political violence we're doing by trying to wipe out the free black vote. And there that is again in Baltimore. Harper's Weekly is going to be like our main source for a lot of this. So, wow, I might be able to finish the chapter today, so we can try to catch up with my Tuesday, Thursday class, even though we've missed 2 Mondays now. And we might miss next Monday because the weather this weekend is going to be bad. We'll see what happens. Just keep an eye on your alerts. Basically, if your school is out because of weather, you're not coming in here. Is the rule. So, despite the fact that they were fighting for civil rights, most Northerners did agree that blacks were inferior to whites and not fit to govern themselves. So, they were only willing to fight for so long. So there was apparently this like corruption thing against Grant in 1872. They nominated Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, the one that we've been seeing in those previous images. He teamed up with the Democratic Party despite being a Republican to try to oust Grant. However, Grant used the, quote, bloody flag that basically any vote against Grant tarnished the memory of the war. And also, the Arlington Cemetery had just been created, so the sacrifice of the Civil War was still really fresh in everyone's minds. So, yeah, Grant won that one out. However, despite Grant winning, Republican power was waning. Congress removed most remaining penalties on the Southern officials. By 1974, Democrats had a majority in the South again. Began removing troops from the South. And this is really that main moment is, while, and I hate to say this, but while Americans like to get together and champion most Americans like to get together and champion some moral ideal, when economic problems happen, they completely forget about that. And they're like, oh, we got to worry about how much things cost. Forget about these people that are suffering and being murdered. I'm more concerned about, bread going up by 2 cents. Northern Pacific Railroad collapsed. The said collapse created strikes, and the railroad company owners wanted the government to bring troops in to break up the strikes rather than keep them in the South to, protect black citizens that were being murdered by the Klan and other groups. And then finally, the 14th Amendment had its protections narrowed to the point that the Civil Rights Act was basically struck down by 1875. So the 14th Amendment, as it exists today, is basically used to make corporations people. That's where that comes from. Is corporations can put as much money into political things as they want because they're people, while giving people less rights. I don't know. It's weird. So here's a bunch of stuff on Horace Greeley. What I know about Horace Greeley? He's there working with Jefferson Davis. I forgot the Confederate president's name. I don't know who this long-legged guy is, but every time you see him in a political cartoon, he always looks like this. So there he is. Now that the good ship Union has safely passed through the Sea of Troubles into peaceful waters, shall the helmsman be thrown overboard. And then there's Horace Greeley wanting to work with the devil. All right. We'll do this next time. We're like one slide away from finishing the chapter, but we'll just do that next time and to start chapter 15. I'll go ahead and put this up on Blackboard for everybody though, so you can have it. But yeah, I'll see y'all. I hope next Monday. Again, if your school is canceled due to bad weather, don't try to come in. Don't try to make it in. I don't want anybody sliding off the road. Hopefully, I'll see you guys on Monday. You too.